Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and want to welcome you to this discussion with myself and William Miller. And William is, or Bill, is a Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Psychiatry at the University of New Mexico and the founder of motivational interviewing, and he's been doing empathic listening for over 40 years, been teaching empathic listening. He's also the author of this wonderful guide on listening well, the art of empathic understanding. And what we want to do today is have a longer empathic-based discussion talking about Carl Rogers' vision of really a culture of empathy. I had recently seen an interview with him, and Carl Rogers, of course, is a famous psychologist, well-known, world-renowned clinical psychologist. Anyway, so he did an interview with a South African journalist. This is from the 80s or so. And he really laid out his vision for how to address all the different social conflicts that are going on in the world. And so Bill and I want to use empathic listening with each other to talk about how might we really build a movement and a culture of empathy. And so to begin with, Bill, would you like to just reflect back what you heard me say so far?
You're hoping that some of the things that Carl Rogers discovered and taught might be useful in creating more of a culture of listening to each other respectfully rather than just clashing with each other.
Yeah, and we have so many conflicts in the world. If you look at the political discussion, it's sort of an us versus them, and people not listening to each other. And this is really a means, this vision, I think, that Carl Rogers had to, as a way of people dialoguing effectively with each other. And he used this, his empathic listening process in conflicts like in Northern Ireland and South Africa, as well as Nicaragua and many other places around the world. So we want to really, I just really like to just think about how do we, what can we do to build a more empathic culture like this that we can spread into politics and really in all parts of life.
It's a different way of being, and how can you convey that? How can you teach that?
Yeah, I feel heard. So I'll just say I'll feel heard, which I feel heard. That's just the next person's turn to speak. So yeah, I feel heard. Thank you.
Well, that didn't take long. I've gotten interested in this in political discourse in particular because I'm just distressed at the extent to which people perceive there being two sides and only two sides. And if someone's on the other side, you just don't talk to them. You don't listen, certainly don't listen to them.
Yeah, so you're feeling some distress about the political situation of people not listening and talking to each other and maybe having enemy images of each other.
Yeah, and I think that's a real obstacle to governing, first of all. I mean, it hasn't always been that way. And there have been certainly times when people in Congress worked across the aisle, knowing they had differences to begin with, but trying to find a way to collaborate and pursue what they had in common.
Yeah, so it hasn't always been this bad, and you've seen times when the politicians actually talk with each other and collaborate, and so you're having some concern about the present discourse.
Well, this is as polarized a time as I can remember. And even friends either unable or deciding not to talk to each other around these kinds of issues as if this is not an okay topic for conversation if you happen to disagree.
Oh, so it's not just in the political world, but also with friends and like family, sort of more intimate people just not being able to talk with each other.
Yeah, that's what I'm seeing, that even among your social contacts, there's this sense of, well, are they on my side or are they on the other side? And if there's a sense of, well, they're that other party or what, conservative or liberal or whatever it is, then we just don't, either we don't talk about this or we don't listen to each other about it.
Mm-hmm. So if they're on the other side, we don't listen to them, or we just sort of avoid the issue.
Yeah, you got it. Yeah. And I think that connects with what you were talking about, of trying to create a culture where rather than automatically arguing or disagreeing, you listen more and try to understand.
So how do we really build a culture that has listening and understanding sort of at the core?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So back to you.
Okay. Yeah, you could just say something like "I feel heard" or whatever, anything, just to transition. Just for the viewers. One thing we're trying to do with this is to model the dialogue, and hopefully, people will see this and they'll say, "Oh, I can try this." So, we've been trying to do it with politicians as well. We did what we call a radical empathy circle. So we had our local candidates. Radical Empathy Forum, and we had local candidates running for the California State Assembly take part in an empathy circle, using this empathic listening. And we had 11 participants, so we divided them into 2 groups, and they were using empathic listening with each other, and they were really valuing it and able to do it. And I could see it's really doable, so yeah.
It's not rocket science. It's possible.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what we're trying to do here too. Is you and I modeling this form of listening, where one person speaks, the other person is just waiting. Hearing what they say, reflecting. Just the essence of what they're hearing. Waiting for the person to fully express themselves, and then take their turn to speak and do the same thing. So I just wanting to. I guess I'm thinking in terms of anyone watching this, that just kind of really explain what it is that we're trying to do and accomplish here.
It's about taking turns, speaking and listening.
Yeah. And it's so simple. In a sense, it's so simple. It's like, it's like the core. It's like, and for example, when Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, had their forums that they did, their discussions. I would have loved to have seen that be an empathic listening process. Mm-hmm. Instead of them sort of arguing, sort of being in a debate, if they could have actually used just empathic listening with each other, I think it would have been just transformational for the country to see that.
It's such a different way of being than adversarial.
Yeah. So then it's a question of, how do we really transform the society? Because, it's a big society, it's a big culture, and it seems a bit daunting in some way to really bring these values, to the front. Somehow we need to get into the media attention, get into seems like into the core of maybe the politics. You have, core politicians perhaps using empathic listening, or movie stars, or people who are in great conflict. So the society could actually see this modeled in a more, publicized, more larger, more, more in the mass media, I guess. That's one sort of idea. It seems that somehow we need to bring this into the core of the culture, to get attention for it.
That's your hope. You know how to do this one-to-one, but there's this daunting question of, is it possible to do this on a broader scale in a way that begins to move our society in a more empathic direction?
Yeah, and I'm really wondering what ideas you have. So with that, I feel heard. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Well, I mean, there are pieces of this that are so powerful. I think in practice for doing empathy circles, basically, I interviewed 7 different people I know and respect and like, who I thought would have very different political views from my own, and indeed they did, and said, what I want to do is put on my listening hat. I know how to do that. Can I do that in in having a conversation with somebody with very different political views, and not get into arguing, not get into expressing my own views in the moment, but just really trying to understand. And I found I could. I found that it was surprisingly easy to take that same skill and apply it here. It's just something that I hadn't done before much, because there's almost something about a political discourse that you want to argue, or you want to kind of try to disprove what the other person is saying, even though you know you're not likely to persuade somebody by going about that. So it was an interesting experience to put on that empathic listening hat and have a conversation about pretty hot political issues.
Oh, okay. So you just had the intention personally that you went and talked to a variety of friends and people with different political backgrounds and went to just listen to them. And you found it fairly easy just to listen to them about their political views, just being a listener. And that you're saying that that politics is sort of seen as this combat sport, that it's almost like inherent to it, that it is about, kind of battling it out. And it's not about this listening, which you did, which seemed to work, actually, just to go and listen to people.
Yeah. And governance, I think, oughtn't be about combat. It ought to be about finding what's our collective best interest and moving in that direction. But the surprise for me was that, no, I can do this. This is not all that difficult. It's just putting on a different framework for the time being.
Mm-hmm. So it's really about a different mindset or different framework, that it's not even that hard to do if you can shift into that different mindset.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what I said to my friends that I was going to have this conversation with is, I'd like to take an hour just to really understand your political views. I won't be expressing my own. I won't be arguing or disagreeing. I need practice at listening to opinions that are different from my own. Will you help me get that practice? And everybody said yes.
So the approach that you used then was just to explain that you're trying to get practice in listening to other people, and explained what you were going to do, and you said ask for permission if that was okay. It sounds like, and they all said yes, sure, I'm glad to do it. So,
well, in the course of the life of an ordinary person in our society, how often does it happen that you have an hour with somebody where their only agenda is to understand how you see the world and your meaning, without messing with you, giving you advice, asking you a whole lot of questions, interrogating, saying their own stuff. I mean, it's such a gift to spend time with someone with no agenda other than simply understanding.
So people are sort of, sounds like, maybe appreciative of that. We don't get that in society, where someone just comes to listen to you just to understand your point of view, and they actually maybe to see it as even a gift to receive that, because it's so uncommon.
That's right. It's a gift. Yeah, I feel heard. Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So that's something that we've tried to do with this empathy tent. Like we have this tent. It's called the Empathy Tent. Has big banners on it, and it says come talk to us. We listen, and we go to these. We've been going recently to these political rallies where the right wing comes to, especially like here in Berkeley or Sacramento or Los Angeles, and then there's these counter demonstrators that come, and they've turned into just knockdown, drag out street fights. I mean, bloody, punching, people getting, pretty, beat up and arrested, and it's just total mayhem. So in this environment, we're there with the empathy tent saying, hey, we're here to listen. We're here to offer listening to both sides. And we've tried to bring parties from both sides together to help them use this empathic listening, which we're doing right now. And so that was sort of one practice that we've been doing.
Like physically a tent.
It's a 10 by 10 canopy,
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And here's an environment, you literally enter the environment where someone listens to you, and that's it. They're purposes to hear you.
Yeah. And then when the right wing was coming to Berkeley, I contacted the leader of the group and said, "Oh, would you be willing to do an empathy circle?" You know, they'd never heard of an empathy circle with someone from the other side, and they said, "Okay, sure, we'll do it." And then I reached out to the other side, the left here in Berkeley, and there was like in this one counter rally, there was like 30 different organizations that it's kind of signed up to take part, you know, to support it, you know, community. I could not get anyone to be willing to dialogue with the other side. I mean, I feel a little bit of sadness about that. It was like, yeah, so.
Disappointing. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not even willing to listen. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was even the church, there was even a church group that was going there to rally. And I said, "Oh, would you, you know, the other side is willing to talk. And would you be willing to, you know, talk with them?" And they said, "Oh, we don't have time." I was like, what?
Yeah.
It's like, we don't have time. We have time to go organize, get all these people together, go up there and have signs and scream and yell, but we do not have time to just sit down and have a discussion with the other side. So
that is disappointing. Not terribly surprising, I think, but gosh, can't we even listen to each other?
I know, and I'm so like irritated because I had considered myself sort of, you know, progressive on the left, and here's kind of the, you know, my community that I thought, and they're not willing to, you know, sit in dialogue. So that really kind of threw me, like, you know, how do we really address this? That it seems that it's kind of led me to that for what we're doing, it's sort of outside of the left and right. You know, this is sort of its own thing. It's its own empathic way of being, where both sides are in need of being heard and seen. And, you know, there's got to be some group that has the capacity to listen to both sides. And that's what I think we need to create is that.
It was striking to you, though, that people from the right, as you perceive it, were willing to do this. And from your own side, from the people that you identify with, nobody wanted to listen.
Yeah. And there's a real disappointment of it. Yeah. And so I was also thinking, you know, about how you were approaching it, to just go and just offer to listen. And it's part of your book that I showed is, you know, you've sort of laid out the steps in terms of how to get better at listening, how to practice listening, and then you end it with actually that exercise of going out to listen to others. So there is a whole kind of preparation for doing that in the book. So a plug for your book.
Well, there is some skill involved in it. It's not something we usually learn in growing up, and it's surprisingly challenging when you try it the first time. It's like, it looks easy. Someone who's good at it makes it look easy. And yet when you actually try it, it's like, oh, well, this is a little challenging.
Yeah. And so it's really something in terms of how do we kind of build this culture of empathy, this culture of listening, you know, mutual listening. It seems like if it started in the schools, you know, way back, if there was like these skills, if I would have had learned these skills in school, you know, in, you know, first grade, second grade, third grade on, it would have had really would have positively affected my life. So I can just see if we could replicate that. And so it's sort of like, how do we bring this into the schools, into these institutions? And it seems like it's going to take sort of like political action or something to, you know, really advocate for bringing this in to the schools.
Children can learn this. I mean, it's something that you can learn in school. We just haven't been teaching it.
Yeah, and the other part was the political part. That, you know, there's the sort of these skills have been really used in the mediation and psychology, in the fields of mediation and psychology, and somehow it's the sense I get is that community hasn't been political in the sense of saying, we're going to run an empathy candidate, right? We're going to have candidates, they've been waiting for the candidates to come to them to, oh, we want your skills, we want to use your skills, instead of saying we're sort of our own group, and we're going to run for office and bring these skills into the political world or something. I don't know.
Those worlds don't seem to go together naturally. The empathic mediation, listening, peacemaking world, and the world of politics.
Yeah, but I think they could. I think they could. Yeah. So I feel heard. Yeah. Thank you.
Something as you were talking about sides that I've been wrestling with also is, in a way, I think sides is an illusion. I mean, there are times when it comes down to a vote, of course, and there's an outcome of the vote. But the idea that there are only two political views is an absolute illusion. I mean, it's not so. You sit down with people from whatever label and listen. There's a lot of variety among viewpoints. If you don't mess with them, push them, just listen. A lot of variety within the left or the right, or independents, or whatever it is. And yet we act as if they're just two teams. It's like a sport. Yeah.
So you're seeing that it's sort of seen like there's two teams, there's just two different opinions, but within, if you go into each of those sides, that there's really a wide variety of sides. So you're looking at that there really is so many different sides or different aspects or different ideas versus just two that are in competition with each other.
Yeah, I realize it's a little like my experience with racial ethnic groups, that we have these labels, African American or Hispanic American or non-Hispanic white or whatever. But as you listen to people within any of these categorizations, there are enormous varieties, and there's more difference within any of those groups than between groups on average. So even if you know someone's racial ethnic identification label, you really don't know much about them, except maybe stereotypes. And it's the listening process that begins to teach you about who this individual is. And we're not all alike within racial ethnic groups or political groups or whatever. There aren't just two kinds of people in the world.
Mm-hmm. So you're really making a note about how these categories get created, and they're sort of like stereotyped versus really getting into the specifics of each individual person. There's just so much variety of everyone. Everyone's so unique, and there's
that's the illusion that I mean, if somebody's conservative, I still don't know much about them. I mean, what variety there is in viewpoints within that. Now, when you get into a oppositional match, like as if it were a football game or something, maybe people begin to behave like they're all uniform. We see some of that now. I mean, you don't disagree with your own party, or you don't disagree with your own friendship group or whatever. But in fact, we're quite different from each other. And that variety is important. And yet when we think in terms of sides, then we don't understand that. There's an illusion that, well, we're all alike and they're all alike. And on talk radio, us and them language is there all the time, as if there are only these two groups and we're the virtuous ones and all of them are flawed. And it's part of it is just that assumption that there are two sides.
Yeah, so I think what I'm hearing is that these categories are sort of illusions. That the categories sort of don't exist. It's much more complicated than that. And if these gets kind of collapsed into us versus them, that's an illusion. Yes. That it's just that simple. And sort of, so it sounds like you've really been thinking about that aspect of being an illusion, and that we're kind of in this illusionary world of sorts of labels.
And then it's like racism, that you begin treating people as if they're a label or they're a stereotype or some monolithic entity, rather than individuals who are quite different from each other.
So instead of seeing people as some kind of a group or a stereotype, really try to see them as an individual of who they are.
Which we are.
It's closer to the reality, I guess, too.
That's right. Yeah.
If there's an illusion of the stereotype, then the seeing each person for who they are is sort of getting closer to the reality of life. Yeah.
You got it. I feel it.
Okay. Yeah. That's, yeah, it's like how to kind of spread that awareness. And, you know, for me, it's like how to, you know, take, well, in October, there's a conference in Los Angeles called Politicon, and it's it's a big political, you know, left and right come, and they have a lot of different of the, you know, the pundits and the, you know, the activists and so forth. So we're taking the empathy tent there, and there's something like 300, you know, media, the supposedly organizations that come. So we're gonna set up the empathy tent there. We actually have a booth, and we're gonna be trying to do some, you know, mediation between the different sides there. So do some listening, you know, just what we've been doing here in Berkeley and so forth. So again, we're trying to get in, you know, take this message into the political sphere, and yeah.
But you're doing more than taking a message. You're actually doing it.
Yeah.
You're actually listening. And so in a way, you're answering your own question of, well, where do you start? And what you're starting by actually listening, by sitting down in the midst of all this conflict and showing how you listen.
And we would like to, that's why I appreciate, you know, you taking part in this to, you know, practice and demonstrate it, is that if we can do this with the politicians and the left and right, you know, the different pundits, if we can just have them having these slower dialogues, and we can model this, and I guess I'm kind of saying, like, it's like there's a need for spreading it more widely. And, you know, how do we do that? And that was something in that interview I mentioned about Carl Rogers. He mentioned it too. It's like, you know, the society, he was saying, didn't seem ready to take on these values for whatever reason, and there would need to be some kind of a catalyst or something to, you know, bring it into the culture. And that now, you know, now might be the time with, you know, this really getting so hyper partisan, and, you know, people are just so upset with, you know, with each other. So.
And you'd like to be part of that catalyst.
Yeah. And I'm also looking like how to inspire others. You know, it's like, it's one thing, it's a little lonely, it can get lonely. You know, it's like, you know, how do we get, you know, because, you know, to be that catalyst, we need, you know, you need community, you need support, and, you know, you want to sense, at least I do, I want a sense of things moving forward in something building. And, you know, it's like, for example, there was a filmmaker came by the empathy tent, and she'd been to all these like Trump, you know, anti-Trump and pro-Trump rallies, you know, around the country. She'd been along the East Coast and the West Coast, and she was making a documentary called Trump Phobia. And she said, you know, you guys are the only ones who are doing something like this at all these different rallies. And, you know, that felt pretty good, you know, that, hey, we're doing something unique, but still, you know, you want sort of a movement. We don't want to be the only ones, only ones out there.
It is a lonely feeling then of like, am I the only one? And I think of your mentioning earlier that among your progressive friends, nobody seemed to want to even do this. I mean,
yeah,
so that is a lonely feeling.
Yeah, I just don't understand that. It's yeah, but I guess maybe that's what it takes, is somebody's got to start the ball rolling, and, you know, if we can attract others and at least model it, you know, so we get a snowball kind of going.
Just seeing it, being able to see this happen, you can see there's something different going on here than what I'm seeing in talk shows or the rest of political discourse.
Yeah, it might attract others too.
Yeah. That's a hope.
Yep. So, yeah, I feel heard. Thanks.
We should go a little faster, though.
Yeah, that's it. It's got a little too slow.
Uh-huh.
Thanks for that last bit.
And something you said just a little while ago really struck me too. This slows down the process. This slows down the conversation, which it really does. And I think that's important. You have time to reflect and think about, well, what do I really believe about this? And it's not boxing. It's not just immediately having to respond and defend your viewpoint. You got all the time in the world to kind of explore and think about it.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying another important aspect of this is the slower aspect. It's being slower and sort of a sense of spaciousness and time to explore, instead of it being like a quick boxing.
Yeah.
Intent. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what, at least how I heard what you were saying about it. It slows it down. It's a very different feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I felt heard. Was there more, or did you want to say?
No, that struck me just in passing that, yeah, I've seen that too. And that's an important piece of it. I mean, I've tried to think about what's useful about this, or what's powerful about this in talking with people with whom we disagree. I mean, if you're in a legislature in Congress and there's this aisle, I wish we'd get rid of the aisle, first of all. It's the idea that everybody on one side sits on this side and everybody on the other side sits on the other side itself is problematic. But even in that context, what's healing or what's helpful or what's useful about this way of being in having conversations where you disagree? So that's what I've been kind of turning over, and in the book did some of that too. And I mean, one of the things is when you listen in this way, first of all, you're making sure that you understand that you're not making assumptions about what you think, what you believe you heard means, but rather you're getting a much clearer sense of what the person actually thinks, what they actually mean.
Mm-hmm. So you're wondering, like, what is the positive benefit of this listening, this empathic listening, and you're even sort of pondering that, and that you see that one of the components is that you get like a sort of an accuracy of understanding. You really get to sort of clear up maybe misconceptions and get a clearer sense of what the person is really saying.
Yeah. So first, I get it right as a listener. I'm sure I understand. I think an awful lot of the time we respond to what we think the person meant, and it may be very different from what they actually meant. And if you're responding to a stereotype, that's a person from the other side. So easy to make that mistake. But then I also think it helps the person that you're listening to reflect on and know better themselves what they believe. They can take the time to really reflect on it and say, well, it's not exactly that, and get clearer themselves. So we're, in a way, both getting clearer at the same time about what's important to the person, what matters most to them, what they care about, what all this means to them. So I think that's a useful thing in this kind of discourse when people disagree with each other.
So
go ahead.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. So one of the things. So you're looking at what are the benefits, like what's really happening here. And the first one you were saying is that as a listener, you're really getting a clear picture, really clear understanding of what the person is actually saying, instead of having some stereotypes or misconceptions that you're responding to. You're really hearing what their real point is, or what their experience is. So you're getting that clarity and accuracy. And the second part is that the person who's speaking is actually getting more clarity for themselves too. So they're able to experience their own thoughts, their own experience, and kind of even get more clarity themselves. So it's sort of like a mutual clarifying.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. In addition to that, if you don't listen, if you argue, and in high school I was taught how to debate, I wasn't taught how to listen. when you debate, the other person's position hardens. So when you're arguing with somebody, they more tightly defend and become more committed and bound to whatever particular view they're talking about. So the very act of adversarial disagreement kind of hardens the person's heart and perceptions. And they get more and more extreme and more committed to something that they might not have been that committed to before you began pushing so hard. So listening avoids that. And I think that's important too, that you don't create artificial polarization just by not listening. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So when a discussion turns into like more of a debate, or the nature of a debate is that the competition aspect creates a hardening of the positions. And if you have a hardening of the positions, it's harder to shift and change, and so it has that hardening, and actually also getting more extremes. It hardens and then it gets more extreme, and so that's one of the negative aspects of sort of a competitive debate.
Of not listening, yeah.
Of not listening. So of not listening. Uh-huh.
Psychologist called Darrell Bim long ago had a little called self-perception theory, that I learn what I believe the same way you learn what I believe. I learn what I believe by hearing myself talk. And so if I'm caused to defend extreme positions and say, absolutely, this is right, and there are no exceptions, I get more and more committed to that and convince myself, I guess that's what I really believe. So this is a way of avoiding that. And I guess the other thing that occurs to me as a value in this is that the act of listening to someone honors them. It's respectful. It says you're an individual human being just like I am, and you're worth listening to and you're worth understanding. And that itself inspires collaboration. Whereas debate inspires taking sides and fighting it out and winning, listening inspires listening in return and collaboration. So this very way of being itself moves away from two sides fighting it out toward let's talk.
Mm-hmm. So the mutual listening is it. You didn't use this word, but it's like you matter and I matter. So it's like a sense of we both matter, and with that sense of that we matter, the collaboration can grow out of that.
Yes. Whereas the adversarial stuff says implicitly, you don't matter. Your view is wrong.
So it's the opposite of you matter. When you're in a fight, the other person doesn't matter. So it's like two different approaches to mattering.
There's something about the process itself that is healing. It's interesting. It's not just the content of the conversation; it's the way it's happening. Yeah. So I feel heard. Good.
Okay. So the process is important. It's like it's not just like what we're talking about, the subject matter, but how we're talking with each other, the process itself that has these different benefits, positive benefits.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So that makes me think again is how to bring this into the political realm, because I see this as that's where we need it, in Congress and this, the state governments and other places, because the systems the social structures are based on sort of competition. There's a inherent, a vote, getting the vote, the competition. You have to win. And I guess it could be ameliorated, it's just in the way people think, but still the system is geared towards that. So it's almost like there needs to be a shift in the structure of the political structure, that maybe one day out of the week or the month, the politicians need to do empathy circles with each other just to have a 2 or 3 hour, or longer sort of session of just practicing or something like that, something to structurally, bring this Yeah.
A competitive winning perspective is almost built into a two-party system. It doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
But it invites thinking us and them.
Yeah.
And who's going to win? Yeah.
Yeah, and the other part was that so there would need to be could be some structural changes, and I had thought with the empathy tent, it seems so daunting to, make these changes. And one thing I had, our empathy tent actually got started at Occupy Wall Street. So Occupy Wall Street was set up as the 99% against the 1%, right? So it's still an us versus them mindset. It's like, it's like the 1%, they're sort of the evil ones, the 99%, or the virtuous ones or whatever. And I thought, well, that's not, that's not really the vision that I have of, everybody matters, right? You said that so beautifully there. So I took the empathy tent and I set it up at the occupation in Berkeley, and the tent said 100% empathy. so trying to advocate for for everybody mattering. We don't have any enemies. Everybody matters, because it seems that as soon as you go into the enemy images of even the 1%. It's kind of like you can chop their heads off, and then there's the next 1%. You chop their heads off, the next 1%. So it's very, as soon as you start seeing enemies anywhere, the whole consciousness, it has that in it, and it's just going to kind of eat away at, your soul or your sense of everybody mattering. If somebody doesn't matter, then you never know if you're going to be the one that's not going to matter next. So there's always that threat.
There's no end to it.
Yeah. And it can really go downhill. So we've been wanting to advocate for that 100% empathy. So I had thought of is, what if we started an Occupy Empathy from the ground up? So it would be not like Occupy Wall Street, but we make it an encampment that we're calling for a culture of empathy. Like Barack Obama said, there was an empathy deficit. When he ran for office, he talks about it over and over again. And I thought, we set up this Occupy Empathy. Everybody's invited, and we're sort of having a petition of redress of grievance that there's an empathy deficit, and we're petitioning the government to do something about it. One of the main things that we would do is Congress, the politicians aren't dialoguing, and we demand that they take part in empathy circles or something like that, to advocate for the dialogue, but do it in an assertive way. Like we're out there asserting this, and we're willing to, take action for it. So
that idea of an empathy day, it's almost like a Sabbath, that we take a break from the way we usually do business, and we try something different on this day, which to me that feels very hopeful.
Yeah, that was one part of it, with the politicians. But I'm talking about actually an encampment where we take the tents and we set up around the clock, just like Occupy Wall Street was.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And we actually set up, in Zuccotti Park, I think that's the park across from the White House, or in the Capitol Mall, right? We have the empathy tent. We're not leaving here until, Congress, you guys kind of you all have empathy circles with each other. So have that sort of be the demand, is we're here until you guys start talking to each other.
So that's the Occupy piece of it.
Yeah.
We've got our tent here, and we're going to be here as a witness, almost like a hunger strike or something.
Exactly.
Until some listening begins to happen.
Yeah, and I actually thought of that too. Yeah, the hunger strike, that could be a means. It's just like Gandhi had done that too, when there was the conflict between the Muslims and the mass, riots, killings, and so forth between the Muslims and the Hindus in India. He went on a hunger strike, until they were willing to come together and talk. So it's very, somewhat similar to that.
your presence next to the, whatever legislative process is happening. You're outside presence, but saying, we're hoping some of this presence can come inside.
Yeah. Yeah, and model that presence. Yeah, but be assertive too, because I think that there's a lack of assertiveness somehow. It's like the empathy movement is sort of saying, well, we're here to support things, but we're not going to rock the boat, kind of, right? And it's like there's an assertiveness saying, look, we're here, we're going to rock the boat until this sort of happens. Sort of more like the like Gandhi with his movement, and the civil rights. It was like we're going to do some kind of actions that kind of show the lack of listening, or sort of have these social sort of a social impact,
which requires something more than just listening.
Yeah. I feel heard. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and that's an interesting mix of things, that if all you do is listen, like think about a marriage or an intimate relationship. If all that one person does is listen, their partner never gets to know them. I mean, there are more skills, assertive expression skills beyond just listening. So it is a back and forth process. Now, I didn't ask that of the 7 friends that I talked to. I said, I just want to understand your perspective. But one of them afterwards said, no, I want to do the same thing. I'd like to take an hour, I'd like to sit down for another hour and just listen to you. And I thought, that really is what it's about, of turn taking, as you were saying earlier. It's not just one way listening. You want to get to the place where you're assertively expressing yourself while someone else listens, and then you take turns doing the opposite.
So you're saying that this is more than, to create sort of a culture of empathy is more than just one person doing all the listening, be it in a, like when you're listening to the people on the variety of people from political spectrum, or even in a relationship, that there's a relationality of mutual listening, and it's important to do both. And that it sounds like you listened to a variety of people, and only one of them was willing to, they kind of initiated offering to listen to you, but that seemed hopeful to you.
I hadn't asked for that, but I could have in the beginning. I could have said, I want to take an hour to really understand your perspectives. And then if you're willing, I hope you'll take an hour just to listen to my perspectives. I didn't set it up that way. But I think that's what I would do now.
So you had sort of had an invitation, like, oh, here's this invitation. May I listen to you? And that was just the extent of the invitation. And now you're thinking, oh, maybe an invitation would be that we would do have mutual listening. I would listen to you would listen to an hour, and maybe they would listen to you. So it's sort of part of how the invitation is set up.
Yeah, I think so. And I set it up for just one way. That's all I invited the person to do. But I think we can invite people to two-way. I mean, some of what you were saying earlier just gave me the thought, maybe the progressive side, or wherever we find ourselves, more on the left end of things, maybe we need this more than the other side does. Maybe we need to learn these, practice them, and are less willing to do that. But you can't just go to liberal events and do this, because there's nobody expressing a different perspective. What you need is to listen two ways, to listen to people with quite different perspectives, and they listen to you, and you take these respectful turns with no goal other than understanding, no intent to persuade, simply to understand. And it's a powerful process.
So you're speculating, oh, perhaps being on the left, maybe the left needs this. We're offering this in the left, but then thinking maybe there's not enough difference between people to find people who you really have differences with, that might be sort of more powerful, or.
As you're saying it, though, I realize that the difference is one of the hardest places to practice this. And it's probably not where you start in learning good listening. Start with somewhat easier situations. Because in a way, listening to somebody whose political views are very opposite to yours is almost a final examination in listening school. That's one of the harder places to do it. So I don't think you don't have to have people with really, really different views to be able to practice this. It's a skill you can develop listening to your friends, listening to your family members with no goal to understand.
So it's maybe finding the most extreme case might not be the first step, but sort of build up to it with your conversations, but build to that.
You got it. Yeah, it's in a way that's the most challenging, and that usually the most challenging isn't usually the best place to learn in the beginning. You don't start with the hardest piano piece when you're trying to learn the piano. You start with somewhat easier things, and you build up. So, yeah. Okay, I feel heard.
Yeah. Okay. Then, one thing, I've done a lot of interviews with people around the topic of empathy. So for example, I interviewed you about your book, and those two bookshelves right there are all books on empathy, and I've interviewed most of the authors. But I have been thinking I need to maybe find who are the most extreme on the other side and start doing kind of dialogues with them
you could do that.
Yeah. To make it more engaging it's I had there's a book out called Against Empathy by author Paul Bloom. Yes. And he had started writing, like he's professor at Yale. He started writing about Against Empathy, like in the New Yorker, starting like 5 years ago. So the first time, the first article I saw, the first thing I did is I looked him up, got his email, sent him an email, said, "Hey, would you like to do an empathy circle with me? I'd like to empathize with you about your criticisms of empathy." And he first said, "Okay, I'll do it." And then, shortly thereafter, he said, "Oh, I don't have time." And I've been after him for the past 5 years to talk with me, and he will not talk with me. It's like, so there, it's, and I've had that experience with some people. It's similar to maybe it's my approach, I don't know, but it's with the left, asking them to take part in empathy circles, and there is people who just like, I don't want to talk. So that was sort of an extreme. I mean, I don't know, not extreme. It's just, so anyway, that's just something that came up to me as I'm thinking about how to really have these dialogues with people who are more maybe different from myself or something. Yeah.
And there may be something about the way in which you make the invitation that influences whether they feel okay about it or not.
Yeah. But then I'm pretty easy with talking with everyone. When we first set up the empathy tent, there was sort of the right wing was there. They had the Oath Keepers, who were sort of a paramilitary group, and they had sort of staked out the area, and they're all pretty tough looking guys. They're all ex-military. They had their bulletproof vests on, their hats, and it was all looking pretty intimidating. And you hear all this stuff about Nazis and all this kind of stuff. And at first, I was quite nervous about going up to them. We have this little container. I call it's a little box. It's called Empathy Kisses, and there's Hershey's chocolate kisses in there. And we have our empathy card in there. So the empathy card says free empathy and hugs. 10 minutes of free empathy. Come to the empathy tent. So I went over there and talked to him. And, at first kind of nervous, maybe seeing them as, kind of very different, but they were all very friendly. And I just listened to them, just like you were going out and listening. I didn't really, so much share my own thoughts or try to argue with them, but really just tried to listen. And I just felt started developing a real connection and kind of a warmth for everyone. And
people respond well to being listened to.
Yeah. And even we went to, in Sacramento, there was a right-wing rally that we went to, and we set up the tent. We're the only, sort of leftists there, and they were very accepting. And we had a group of 5 or 6 Identity Europa members, and they're the ones that were one of the main groups at Charlottesville, and sort of on the right. And they actually came over to the tent, and we just had dialogues and listened to them, and then we invited them into doing an empathy circle, with using empathic listening, showing them how to take part, doing what we're doing right now. And one of our members is Jewish. So the topic of the Holocaust, came up, and at first they didn't want to. And then it was like, well, what does the Holocaust mean? And our friend colleague said, it means that half my family were killed my extended family were killed, and then the other half was scattered over the world. That's what it means. And then for the Identity Europa person, he just had struggled just to reflect that, just to say, it took him like 4 or 5 times, but finally he did it. He said, oh, okay, this is what it means. But what really struck me is that they were really willing to try.
Yes.
It's like they weren't like saying, no, I'm not going to do this. It's like they were there, they were present. He was saying, okay, I'm going to try this. I'm willing to take part. And, I kind of see that, like at Charlottesville, if there'd been a group of 100, supporters, if we had been there just, with our empathy T-shirts and say, hey, we're here just to listen, we're just here to listen to your point, I think it would have been such a totally, could have been totally different. So, I'm kind of rambling here, but I guess that's sort of a disappointment I have, because I sort of identified on the left, and I've been trying to rally folks like, let's go do this. And, it's like, there's nobody following. So,
well, I hear disappointment and also hopefulness in your voice, in that talking to people that you thought they're way on the other side and they might never listen, they would do it.
Yeah.
It's possible, and somehow maybe it's more possible with people you're really different from than with the people you're identifying with. I don't know. Yeah,
that might be it. That you hear sometimes it's harder in your own family to, there's something, I don't know what it is, but what it is within families, that there's more, maybe identify more, you've got more personal, I don't know, maybe it's like you have to work together more, or something that even makes it harder. Yeah. So my family, my extended family, parents and so forth are more evangelical conservatives, and some of them are Trump supporters, and I've done some mediations in the family, and it kind of worked out really well, and people, the family does like periodic like empathy circles. Guess what we're doing now? We've had circles that lasted 4 hours, just with, So, I don't know, where was I going with that? Just that
it can be harder in the family.
Yeah, with the family. Yeah. I feel heard. That's it.
Well, and wouldn't that be interesting if there's something that's actually easier when you're trying to listen to somebody who doesn't think like you? And maybe it is identification. Maybe it's assuming too much that we're all alike. You don't assume that when you're sitting with somebody with very different views, and maybe it becomes more possible to listen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're just kind of like wondering, speculating, like what is that? Where with people who you are more intimate with, the difficulties there, and it sounds like you're speculating it's identification, that you sort of identify with them, or?
Well, I know that gets in the way of good listening. People, I work in the addiction field, and people early in their own recovery have a hard time listening well because they see themselves in the other person. They can't separate themselves from the other person and see them as different in a way. So when you identify with the person you're trying to listen to, it gets in the way of listening.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm talking to somebody with very different political views, I'm not identifying with them. I'm focused on trying to understand something that is hard for me to understand. And yet that's my goal. That's what I want to do. I want to get it. But I do think it's important for it to be two ways. And but you did that. You started out walking up to guys in their fatigues and just one way listening. Fine, okay. But then you would begin to invite people to empathy circles, to trying this out themselves, and they could do it. I mean, that's sort of an early realization that, well, I can do this. It's something that's different from the Against Empathy book. I've read that. And as I understand his essential argument, it is that our tendency to identify, our tendency to feel with sympathy in a way, to feel with the other person, can cause us to do things that in the long run aren't the best thing to do. In the addiction field, we gave that the name enabling, that you love this person that you live with who's using alcohol or drugs. And just out of that love, you begin to do things that in the long run keep the person doing it, And it's not with malintent at all, but that kind of connection can lead you to do things that are just counterproductive. Well, I get that. That's not what we're talking about as empathy. We're talking about a skill. And so I think that's an important distinction, that there's part of us that's hardwired to empathize in the sense of feeling with and to feel sorry for and to want to step in and help. And that's a good thing. I mean, I'm glad we have that. That's different from the skill that we're talking about.
So you're making some distinctions between what empathy is and what identification is and what sympathizing is, and that you see that the Against Empathy book was really talking about something that's not empathy, that's identification, which can actually be a block to empathy, and as well as in the addiction field that people can sort of maybe enable through sympathizing and supporting someone, that it can come from love, but it's not really empathy.
Well, I don't think we have to say that even, that, well, what you're talking about is not empathy. I mean, that's kind of discounting the author. And one thing that empathy means, I mean, empathy has so many different meanings, and some of it is this hardwired ability to feel with, another person. Some of it's personality characteristics, but I've just said, when I'm talking about empathic listening, I have there's something in particular I mean by empathy, and it can mean other things as well. But here's what I mean. I'm talking about a skill that's learnable and that has very demonstrable effects that can be very beneficial.
So there's a variety of maybe what people mean by empathy. You're just trying to be clear about what you mean by empathy. Right. And here's what I mean by empathy, and here's the set of skills and how it can be demonstrated, and just kind of trying to get some clarity, just express that more clearly.
Right. And it's not necessary for me to say, well, what you mean by empathy, that's not empathy. That's just picking an argument that is not going to be helpful at all. I'm just trying to be clear about this skill that Rogers called accurate empathy, which isn't hardwired into us, but we can learn it. Most of us can learn it. And it's a very useful skill. And it's empathic listening, or whatever you want to call it, is connected in some ways to our innate ability to understand another person's experience or to identify with it, but doesn't come automatically with that hardwired ability.
So we have this, what Carl Rogers is talking about. You're kind of addressing, kind of referencing him and what he's talking about.
Yes.
And that it's, are you saying that it's, that we're hardwired for it? Or that wasn't quite clear on what you're...
Well, there are hardwired pieces of us that can also be called empathy. And I think that the Against Empathy book is just raising some cautions about that can mislead you, or that can lead you to do things that really aren't even in the other person's best interest or in society's best interest. So there's that innate ability that lets you sit in a movie and feel what the actors on the screen are portraying. That ability is an important piece of accurate empathy. But accurate empathy is a particular skill, and I mean the same thing Rogers meant by it, is a particular skill that lets you understand the experiencing of another person and helps them understand their experiencing as well.
So you're just talking about this one aspect, what you're calling accurate empathy. And it's the same experience that Rogers is talking about, where you're just really seeing or sensing what that person is experiencing. And there's another aspect too that I'm hearing, is that there's different aspects, which is the watching of a film and being sort of moved by that film. That's like another kind of experience. So you're kind of differentiating some of these phenomenon or experiences.
Yeah. Empathy is a big field. Just a lot. There's a lot to it. It's an important part of us as people. When I'm teaching reflective listening, I'm just teaching a particular skill that touches on those hardwired abilities, but is something different from the other meanings of empathy.
So there's multiple meanings of empathy, and you're just wanting to distinguish this one empathic listening and accurate empathy or component of it. So, and not to discount, so it's not discounting other definitions and other meanings whose people have, of it. So trying to be clear how you're meaning it.
You got it. It's not that my meaning is the correct one. It's just, here is what I mean. And that sense is very consistent with the practice of empathic understanding. So feel heard,
Okay. Yeah, it's some of these things get very, subtle in terms of with empathy, while it seems there's this empathy, feeling into someone's experience, hearing it versus, and then the experience of identifying with it, or the sympathy. There's small, subtle, differences, but they make sort of a world of difference. I mean, experientially, it can be a huge, experiential difference. Yeah. And I had, while the author, Paul Bloom, the author of Against Empathy, he didn't want to do a video kind of an interview or discussion, but he was willing to do email discussions. We had a long email discussion.
Okay.
And I had this, and I could not understand what he kept meaning by empathy, because it seemed to me every time he was explaining what empathy did, I thought, well, that actually blocks empathy. So it was like, and then when I explained to him, I told him the story of mediating a family conflict and explaining, what I meant by empathy, how I listened to the different parties, people. I empathized, and I asked them to do empathic listening with each other so they could hear. And then he said, well, that sounds like very successful, but it's not empathy. So it seems like this sense of there's this experience, and, one person is naming something, using the same word for one experience and then the same word for another, that it becomes a real challenge to.
But it's not what he meant by empathy.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like the way he said it was, that's not empathy. But I mean, what that really is, I think, is that's not what I mean by empathy.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's so it's really getting clear, trying to get clear on what it is we're talking about here, and it's difficult to kind of clearly articulate this sometimes, or to kind of convey it. So
there are lots of subtleties to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's see what else is coming up.
I have a thought that got triggered here. Just
okay, great.
That to practice the skill of accurate empathy, it's not necessary to feel what the other person is feeling. So here's yet another meaning of empathy that I like Star Trek, and in Star Trek there are characters who are empaths. That is, they literally feel what the other person is feeling. The character of Deanna Troi was one of those, and if someone is suffering next to her, she is suffering herself, literally feeling it. That's something that happens, I mean, not to that extent typically. And in a way, I think that's more what Against Empathy was about. But it's not what I'm talking about. And the ability to be good at empathic understanding doesn't require that you suffer just like the other person is suffering. It's not empathy in that sense. So that's yet another meaning of empathy, of if you suffer, I suffer. That's just a different phenomenon. Mm-hmm. It's true in its own right, but it's different from this skill.
Yeah, so you're really kind of making the differentiations between what it is that you're meaning, and actually what I'm meaning by empathy as well, and what like in Star Trek, the character is an empath, what she's doing, right? She's seeing someone suffering, and then she feels the suffering, and that's not what you're meaning. You're meaning sort of that awareness of what the other person is experiencing, sort of being present with them, and not necessarily taking on what it is that they're experiencing.
That's right. It doesn't require that. That may happen. You may feel some of the same thing. That's okay, but that's not necessary in terms of this skill. It's just a different subtlety of our human experience.
Yeah. So it could happen, but it's not what it is that we're meaning.
Yeah. It's not required.
Yeah. It's not. Yeah. You don't have to suffer when the other person suffers. For to have this accurate empathy.
You got it. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah. So let's see. Let me see, where do I want to? Yeah. Okay. So with that experience, with those different experiences, I think one thing that sort of gets confusing is that for the person who is suffering, I see you suffering, and then I start suffering. So to begin with, the person is sort of empathizing with the other person as we are speaking of it, but then it's shifting to something else. So there's sort of a merging of two different qualities there. There's that they did actually have sort of this accurate empathy, or actually just empathy is what so maybe we need to have a different word, like that they're doing two different phenomenon, right? That they're feeling into the person who is suffering, they're feeling the suffering, and then they're sort of like suffering as well. So they're doing two things, and then the first part is what we're talking about, and then the second part is not what we're meaning necessarily, that you're suffering, right? Is that?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I chose to use empathic as a modifier rather than a noun. Say empathic understanding, different from empathic identification. Empathic identification is kind of feeling with, or being drawn into the feeling of the other person or the experience of the other person. That's okay. It's different from the skill of empathic understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then there's the Against Empathy person, Paul Bloom, he's saying that you feel into someone, like if you're like hopping mad, you're angry, and then you sense that, you perceive that, then you become hopping mad, angry. So you sort of identify with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that contagion and how that happens. So there's two different phenomenon that are happening. There is an empathic component that it starts with, but then it can turn into something else. So that kind of complicates the discussion, because you're talking about these two different experiences. Yeah.
More than two different things. Yeah.
Oh yeah, more than two. There's at least two. Yeah, in that. And
I think I get what Paul Bloom is talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I can think of examples of that.
Yeah.
Of that leading you in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I had the same thing. Yeah. So you can sort of understand what he means, and maybe have even the same. You can see the direction the concerns he has. It makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, actually, I do too. It's like, as I started understanding it more, I said, "Oh, okay, that makes sense." The only thing is, I wouldn't call it empathy. So, but then I guess what you're saying is, which is something that I've heard others say too, is you got to define your terms, before you have the discussion, to be really clear on what you're meaning by the word, and then kind of stick to that definition. So we're kind of in this minefield. Yeah, we're in this minefield of all these definitions and all this misunderstanding because of the different association with the words that we're using.
But it's only a minefield if somebody has to be right. If there is only one correct meaning of empathy, that's not the case. So maybe what we're talking about, Paul Bloom would not call empathy. Well,
yeah.
And I don't have to say that what he's writing about, that's not empathy. It's just something different from what we're talking about here.
Yeah, but what about if you're like a surgeon? Like if you're like a surgeon and you have a scalpel, it's like you don't want different terms for the scalpel, right? It's like there's something about having sort of an effective conversation, effective, working, to have some kind of like a common understanding and a common definition for the doctor asking for a scalpel, and the nurse said, well, I call, a hammer, a scalpel. You know what I mean? That there's, it's just a social issue to somehow to address somehow, how to, I don't know, I just see the problems in terms of communication. It just adds the complexity.
Because we mean such different things by the same words. Yeah.
And this had political ramifications as well, because when Barack Obama said that he was going to choose a Supreme Court justice, and one of the criteria was they had a sense of empathy. And he listed a whole, he said, is intelligent, has the background, and has a sense of empathy, a quality of empathy. And it was like the last criteria, that he gave. But the conservatives the Republicans got really upset by that in the Senate. And they were like railing against empathy. And it's serious. If you look, I recorded, there's 30 speakers talking about empathy, how horrible it is, how terrible it is, or how, and then the response from the Democrats. And the concerns they had was, I thought, is that the conservatives were seeing empathy as sympathy, feeling sorry for people. And they were concerned that you're going to feel sorry for the down and out compared to, me, right? It's going to be unfair. The justice system will be unfair because empathy means feeling sorry for the little guy at the expense of perhaps me. And so the whole thing was just, again, a kind of a definitions kind of a term. And there was no space to kind of clarify it. It was like, I'm sitting here, pulling my hair out. I was like, no, it's the whole different, you're not. So, how do we address these, it's these definition issues are having big repercussions in terms of just general misunderstanding.
It's such a good example of the value of empathic understanding, because if you're responding to what you think the other person meant, you may do something very different than if you really understand what the person means and responding to that. And the fundamental skill, Tom Gordon did a great job with this and interpreting Rogers for the public, that before you respond, make sure that what you're responding to is what the person meant. You know? And they may have been railing against something very different from what Obama had in mind. But I don't know, but you wanted to take the empathy tent over there and have them.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're seeing that if they had been very empathic, right? If they had been, everyone was very empathic, they would have really listened and tried to understand each other about what are you really meaning? You know, Jeff Sessions would have said to Obama, "What do you mean by empathy? You know, what is the real quality?" And study, you know, at sort of his understandings, or and then it led to. Yeah, you know, there's now a form that every circuit, district, and Supreme Court justice nominee has to fill out, which is like a 2 or 3 page questionnaire about their views on empathy. That it's almost like, you know, kind of McCarthyism of, are you now or have you ever been empathic? Kind of. So, I'm not kidding. I've got it listed. I've got a whole list.
Yeah. What a wonderful dialogue that could have been and could be. Of what is the quality that you're looking for when you say you want a judge who's empathic? I mean, tell me more about what that means. What does it look like? You know, rather than immediately responding to what you think it means, and you don't like that.
Yeah. So if everyone was empathic in that environment, it could have kind of been worked out. Yeah, but it's sort of not the situation, though. It's and it's like now we're in this situation where there is this lack of that quality to a deeper degree, and like, what do we do about it? Like, how do we solve this problem? Is sort of, I think, where we're at.
That's what you're interested in, how to get us out of this trap.
Yeah.
Who's the alpha here? Yeah.
Yeah, I feel heard.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great conversation. It's always nice to be listened to.
Yeah. Well, thanks for taking part in it. I was trying to go for a little bit longer. You know, I've seen, as I was mentioning, there's I've been seeing some long form discussions, you know, that has been, you'd think people want just shorter discussions, but the long form, you know, is something that people are interested in. And so thanks for taking part. And maybe just a kind of evaluation, or how was the experience in taking part in this, and what could we maybe do to deepen it, or you know, kind of a next step for this type of a dialogue? Do you have any thoughts about that?
It's a turn-taking kind of dialogue, which is very doable, and it's demarcated by I feel heard, or you got it, or whatever it is. So it's clear when you're shifting your role from being an assertive communicator to being a receptive communicator. It's fine. Because you're demonstrating the very thing that you're hoping people will learn, while also talking about the content. So that's kind of fun. A dialogue normally isn't quite like that. There's a little more kind of back and forth of adding thoughts. And I was conscious as you were talking of the points or you know, content that I would have interjected. I didn't, because I was in a listening role. So it's just a different way of being. That's fine.
Yeah. What I've noticed in like mediations, you know, when you're doing, you can do empathy circle type, restorative empathy circle mediations, where you bring a whole group together, and we start off with the empathic listening with each other, and sometimes it'll go for like an hour and a half, you know, 2 hours, and then something kind of, the energy in the room kind of shifts, and people just start dialoguing with each other, and they have sort of an embedded quality of the turn taking and the listening.
Yes.
And that's sort of, that's something I'm thinking of, like these type of dialogues is, you know, maybe we start off with, if you're already a very good listener, you know, we're both, you know, have that we could start off with the dialogue with using the empathic listening, you know, half an hour, and then go into sort of a looser reflection, you know, more of a back and forth, but with, you know, periodic sort of reflection. Yeah. And you do that in your book too. You're saying, well, you know, you do a few reflections, you ask some questions, you do some reflections. So you sort of start mixing, but there's still the underlying sort of awareness of that sort of empathic awareness.
That was already happening in our conversation here. I mean, if we continue for a while, I think it would migrate into a little more back and forth, and not so much, I have this formal role and you have that formal role for this moment, and then we switch and so on. But good place to start.
Yeah. Okay, well, great. Thank you so much, Bill. And
you're very welcome. Sorry, Antonio didn't join us, but another time perhaps.
Yep.